we've been talking elliptically over the last day and a half about examples, ideas, models that might be useful for thinking about how to restructure, how to really rethink our punishment system. The one thing we didn't have a chance to mention when Vinny was on in our last panel was that he was part of um, a visiting group of corrections officials from around the country who visited Europe, particularly Scandinavia and Germany, and came back with glowing reports about what was going on there. And that began to percolate into other parts of the correction system as well, with a lot of interest. And the big question is, we never like to take advice from elsewhere. In the United States, we think we've got it all nailed down, but clearly we don't. And there's a lot of ways that we can learn from how people in other parts of the world actually deal with incarceration, with the correction system. And it's a subject that really would be a whole day's worth of panels and sessions, but we're going to squeeze it into one panel. We've got some of the best people available to talk about it. We have Baz Dreisinger and Lila Kazemian, who both are with John Jay, and they both have done really amazing work and taking us through and telling folks here what's been going on outside. I want to start with Baz, who is the founding executive director of Incarceration Nations Network, which, as the name suggests, to tell you a little bit about how the things that we have in common around the world are things that we might learn from in a way that in what others are doing. So, Baz, let's start with you and tell us a little bit about the Incarceration Nations Network and how you got there.
Sure. Hi, Steve. It's great to see you. It's great to be in a setting among journalists. I still count myself a journalist among the many hats that I wear, although I don't get to wear it as much as I would like to. So I think folks at John Jay know me as the founder of the Prison to College Pipeline program at John Jay, where I've been for almost 20 years. And I founded the program almost a dozen years ago and had been immersed in the space of US criminal justice reform for many years, and ultimately became really interested, given my interest in other countries more generally, in what incarceration looked like in a global context, and also particularly in what the US incarceration system has brought upon the world, and how we have shaped the way incarceration looks globally. And so I began doing a lot of travel and research in other countries, and that ultimately resulted in my book, Incarceration Nations, in which I looked at 9 countries' prison systems and sort of saw each country as emblematic of a particular issue that crossed borders. And so whether that issue was women, whether it was solitary confinement, whether it was restorative justice, I was thinking about how this issue translates across, borders and boundaries. And so when the book came out, and then the book started coming out in other languages and other countries, and I just continued traveling with it, it kind of ultimately just mushroomed into a movement where I was seeing, I spent some time as a Fulbright scholar in a couple of countries, and just started really seeing how there were folks doing this work all over the world, using very much the same tools, facing the same problems globally, and they weren't really connected. And so I founded the network to create that connection and to be that connective tissue between organizations doing the work all over. And we now have 118 partners who do a range of different kinds of work. So some folks might work in the education behind bars space. Others are working on reentry issues. Others are working on kind of broad reaching policy and advocacy efforts. And what we do as an organization is amplify and elevate and support their work in a whole host of different ways. Some of them kind of creative and artistic through film, through art, other times producing, kinds of research and toolkits that would benefit them, creating connections between organizations who are sometimes right next door to each other, who don't know each other and are able to support each other, learn from each other, and in general, just sort of promote best practices and really strong practices globally.
How translatable are these ideas? I mean, people, it's different cultures we're talking about, different approaches to criminality and criminal behavior. Are
Yeah,
they fungible?
they're very translatable. I mean, one thing, a lot of times people will ask me, how different, oh, I must imagine that prisons look so different. The reality is the problem basically looks the same from one country to another, as I see it and as our partners see it. And this same process of kind of criminalizing others, whoever the other is in a given context, whether it's Aboriginal people in Australia or poor people throughout the global South, you stigmatize and criminalize a group of others, you mass incarcerate them, and then you create, nightmarish conditions while they're inside, disastrous conditions when they come home. And as far as their reentry goes, reentry is a global crisis that looks identical from country to country. And so therefore, when you have a problem that looks so similar, sometimes, yes, different in terms of numbers and scale and the particularities of just how much you can discriminate on someone against someone coming home from prison, for instance. But when you have problems that look so similar, you also have solutions that look really similar. And so reentry work, for instance, doesn't look vastly different whether you're talking about, El Salvador or New York City. So I think that there are a lot of translatable, solutions. I think some of them are bigger than others, and I tend to, we can get into the weeds of it, but I tend to get excited about bigger systemic changes that relate to ideas about open prisons, ideas about restorative justice and radical approaches to mediation and peacemaking efforts and things like that. But overall, the kind of cleaning up the mess looks very similar, and the bigger picture sort of vision of systemic change.
So tell us some stories. Where are places where you think these things are working?
So, I mean, first of all, the disclaimer is nowhere. Nowhere is it working, because we still have prisons and we have them everywhere. And they are, as I get into in my book, and I tend to talk about a lot, they're very much historically a US and a European imposition on the world. And again, I won't get into the whole history. Folks can read my book, but this was an American invention based on European ideas.
So let me start with the concept we've been working at for the entire 2 days, is that our system has, one could say, degenerated into a system of revenge, retribution. Others might say it's always been that essential to our system. Is it different anyplace else?
To be honest, overwhelmingly no. I think Scandinavia, folks, when they visit overseas, will visit Norway, will visit the usual Germany, the usual suspects. And, we've got partners in Norway and Finland. I think there is overall an ethos of equality, and actually an actual equality when we talk about, Norway, when we talk about Finland, when we talk about Germany. These are radically more equal. There's more social services available. That's certainly different. The existence of open prison models whereby people can come and go. Yes, I think those are hugely significant. But, 30% of Norway's prisons are open. The others are not. And while they might have better facilities, certainly, than many other countries, if not almost all other countries in the world, there's still prisons that are engaged in punishing people. There still isn't a massive move away from prison as the fundamental and primary response to crime, really anywhere in the world. But yes, there are inspirational examples. And part of the idea of INN, of Incarceration Nations Network, is that there are inspirational examples all over, not only in the usual suspects, and that there are these kind of pockets of progress and interesting work happening, even in places you might not necessarily expect it. Really strong peacemaking movements in Malawi or Bangladesh, for example, where we have partners, and ways that restorative justice has been systematized in a high level way in various parts of the world that I think are inspirational. I think the other point I'll make just quickly is that, globally speaking, and this is another area where we have to give props to Scandinavian countries, globally speaking, we don't have any kind of staff training that is doing things outside of just throwing people in after 6 months of training, mostly military training. There is nowhere in the world that's recruiting a different sort of person to be a corrections officer or a police officer, frankly, for that matter. And yes, the Norway Academy, where people are trained, and this is true in Finland too, and Sweden, is a very different process. And I think that that's hugely significant.
Can you put some details on that? I mean, let's go into brass tacks. What are they doing differently that we might be doing here?
Well, the job of being a corrections officer in, say, Norway, for instance, because their staff academy is one of our partners, is a respected, well-paid, competitive profession. It is like being a teacher or a professor. It's not, you're not going to make $1 million, but you're going to be well paid, well supported, and well respected. And so therefore the process of training to be a corrections officer in Norway is 4 years of, philosophy, law, social work. It's a radically different sort of training and profession than it is here in the US. And I think that you don't find that anywhere else in the world. We do have a partner, I should say, and I think we've connected them with another partner here in the US, so there's some interest in bringing it here. In the UK, one of our partners, Unlocked Graduates, is actually trying to do the same in the UK. They're sort of a Teach for America for corrections officers. They're actively recruiting a different kind of person, giving them fellowship support and other kind of support to bring them into that profession for a time. And then they funnel them out back into the work, other kinds of professions. Again, with the philosophy that maybe being a corrections officer shouldn't necessarily be a full-time career, full life career. You can do it for a few years, then maybe you'll pursue something else. But I think staff training is something that needs to be radically, and I think this is true for police officers and corrections officers.
There are a lot of crunchy questions that I think would be useful to get into. But one thing that I wonder about is whether you can detect differences in outcomes among these various systems. The cultures are different, yes. The relationship between sentencing and crime, that's also different. But are there cases where you can make a direct comparison that because they do things a certain way in Norway or Germany, recidivism is less, or the rate of imprisonment, incarceration is less?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not, I think recidivism is one measure. It's not a measure that I necessarily put at the top of evaluating these systems, right? But, and I'm sure you've talked about that. But yes, the recidivism rate in Scandinavia is generally much lower than it is elsewhere in the world. But I don't know that it's always so easy to say that that's because of the open prisons, for instance. It's also because of social services, which is something we as Americans know so little about, really, what a really strong social service package and culture of social services looks like. I mean, I bring up Singapore as a good example. They've got a really low recidivism rate, somewhere in the 23% range. But Singapore, we do have Singaporean partners, and in the reentry space, they do some pretty incredible stuff that we can learn a lot from. They find people jobs for, well before they come home from prison. Their parole, something as simple as when you go to your parole officer in Singapore, the office has a job bank sitting there, and they have a national job database for folks coming home. They have a national program that promotes acceptance of formerly incarcerated people in the workplace as part of the national culture. They do reentry, they have job coaching. They do reentry really, really well. But they're also locking up a lot of people for small things like, eating fruit, durian fruit on the subway. So maybe the recidivism rate is low because, these folks didn't need to be locked up in the first place. So I think a lot of times, I think there's a lot of that happening globally as well. This idea of like creating really good rehabilitative schemes for people who didn't need to be rehabilitated in the first place, so that you can have the pleasure of saying, look how good we rehabilitate people. And I see that in a lot of places in the world where you have, whether it's a one-off program or like in a larger systemic way.
Let me bring Lila into the discussion. Lila Kazemian is a professor in the Department of Sociology at John Jay. She's a specialist in one area that sounds archaic to anyone who's outside, which is called desistance from crime. But really, what that means, and if I translate it incorrectly, you will let me know that is, once you're out of prison, do you go back? What is the level of recidivism? How do you stop that? Why do people return to criminal behavior? Why they don't? And in order to do that, she's done a lot of research elsewhere in France, among other things. And she's got a recent book out, Positive Growth and Redemption in Prison, Finding Light Behind Bars, and Beyond. So, Lila, over to you for a bit. Tell us what you found out in your research and your studies.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I will talk a little bit about desistance from crime, which is one of my favorite topics. We know from the presentations in the last 2 days that they've already highlighted American exceptionalism, so I'm not going to go over reiterating the differences in incarceration rates between the US and other nations. We already know that. The bottom line is that we really do things differently in American corrections, and this is especially true if we compare ourselves to other Western nations. And Michael Tonry highlighted this some years ago in his publications, this idea that during periods of rising crime rates, decades ago, 80s, the crime rates were going up everywhere, but the US was one of the few Western nations that chose to increase incarceration during that period. Other countries who were also dealing with rising crime rates didn't choose to do that. And Jeremy Travis raised this point yesterday that this was a deliberate choice on our part. This was a deliberate choice on the part of our policymakers to react this way to rising crime rates. So we certainly are in an era of punitive excess, as Jeremy Travis and Bruce Western have argued. And so the question that we've been asked to discuss today, how can other nations teach us about punishment, incarceration, and release? There's a lot to say on this topic, so I'm going to try to condense it in 10 minutes. And I'd really like to highlight 4 key points on this issue based on my own research with long-term prisoners in France, but also the broader empirical evidence on desistance from crime. So the first point I want to raise, and scholars have commented on this, and I think a few people have talked about this in the other panels, the US discourse has really a dominant concern with public safety, whereas European nations are more concerned with preserving human dignity and procedural justice. So we tend to justify many of our punitive practices in the name of public safety, and European countries are less inclined to go so far with this. It's really not to our benefit, and we know this, it's not to our benefit to disenfranchise individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system. We know that about 95% of people who go in eventually come out. And so in what state do we want these individuals to return to the community? And I think that's a really important question to pose to the public, who oftentimes they, when you tell people you're a criminologist, they often say, why should we care about people who are on the inside? And one of the reasons why people should care is that, well, this person might end up being your neighbor a few years down the line, because most people do eventually come out. And the second point I want to raise is this, and we just talked about recidivism, this excessive focus on negative outcomes, namely recidivism. And this is where the relevance of the desistance framework comes in. So desistance from crime is essentially defined as the process of giving up criminal behavior. And it's a process of change like any other. If you're trying to quit smoking or any other unhealthy habit, it's a process that's gradual, that involves relapses sometimes, right? It's never a linear process. But we know this from our empirical research, but we haven't really integrated this into our policy and practices. And we focus a lot on behaviors because they're easy to observe and they're easy to measure. And how we evaluate reintegration success is whether people reoffend or not. That's our primary metric. But people exhibit a lot of changes in a number of areas that we just don't document, some positive changes throughout their process, either while they're incarcerated or while they're out on parole. But these are not the things that we measure because, again, behaviors are much easier to just to observe and measure. So some of the positive outcomes that we could look at when people are, for instance, on parole, whether they've established ties with, positive ties with their family, and employment, housing, etc. In the prison context, in the context of the research that I conducted in France, one of my findings was that prison misconduct is not always an accurate indicator of risk. So the assumption is if people can't follow the rules on the inside, they're not going to be able to follow the rules on the outside. But actually, a lot of people were breaking the rules in prison. They were doing so to try to further or promote their reintegration process upon release. So a number of people, for instance, were smuggling in USB keys with software that they were trying to learn so that they might be more competitive on the job market, or cell phones so that they could keep more frequent contact with their families. And these are all factors that are associated with more successful reintegration outcomes. And so it's really important to take into account the circumstances of rule-breaking behavior. Prison is such a restrictive environment that if any of us found ourselves behind bars, we would likely break some kind of rules because there are so many rules. And if we apply this to the parole context, it's the same. We all know in this country that a really high proportion of people who return to prison while they're on parole return because of technical violations. And so we don't take into account the reasons why someone ended up breaking the rules, and the outcome ends up being the same. So I think this is quite important. And again, our obsession, our fixation on recidivism, on behaviors, assume that the behaviors are the problem. But crime and violence are really symptoms of the underlying issue. And in my work, I found that the root cause of sustained violence is unresolved trauma and suffering. And we often frame this as though the offenders are on one side and the victims or the survivors are on the other. We treat this as a dichotomy, but actually we also know that people who are incarcerated tend to have extensive histories of trauma and victimization. So it's not so simple to just say, well, this is an offender and this is a victim. It's really not a dichotomy. It's a very blurry line between the two. And what's great in the US is that, we have really promising initiatives right now by the National Institute of Justice, by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that really are making efforts to integrate elements of the Desistance Framework and to look at positive outcomes beyond just the absence of recidivism. And I think one issue that's really important that we don't pay a lot of attention to is that we measure recidivism quite differently in the US than they do in other countries. We tend to use rearrests as a measure of recidivism. Other countries use reconvictions or even incarcerations. And why is that important? Because an arrest, if you're a person of color in this country, an arrest might not mean anything, right? It could be a measure of sort of police activity, but not necessarily of official crime. And especially given that we know that most arrests don't lead to a conviction and that police contacts are heavily skewed towards people of color, I think it's problematic to use arrests that don't lead to further criminal justice processing as a measure of criminal behavior. In some legal cases in which I've been involved, we see individuals who are denied housing on the basis of arrests that occurred years and years ago, arrests where the charges were dropped. I mean, this is absurd. The arrest did not lead to a conviction, but when they do criminal records searches online, they're flagged because there's an arrest, and an arrest equals criminal. And so that person is denied access to housing. So these are precisely the types of policies that push people to commit crime. If you can't secure housing, if you can't secure employment, these are very problematic issues.
So what would we have to change in our system in order to edge closer to that approach?
So I think we just need a huge paradigm shift. And again,
that's easy.
Yeah, well, it's starting to happen. So we can do it step by step. Of course, systemic change takes a really long time. This is the key point, right? It takes no time to adopt policies that are harmful. It takes a really long time to reverse those policies. So I think we all need to be realistic and patient with the types of changes that we want to adopt. But there are, as the previous panel said, journalists play such a key role in this. First of all, in involving the public, educating the public, because there tends to be such a strong focus on the extreme cases, whereas most cases are not extreme cases. Most cases are people who do not pose a threat to public safety, having a criminal record, just for the public to be more educated about what it means to have a criminal record in this country. It does not mean that you're dangerous. There's so many people who have a criminal record who don't pose a threat to public safety. So I think the first component of that is educating the public. And I think the media plays a huge role in that. And then, what our governmental agencies are already doing, which again makes me feel very hopeful and optimistic, is starting to look at ways in which we can measure among parolees, for instance, reintegration success beyond just the absence of recidivism. What are some of the dimensions that we can borrow from the desistance literature to look at ways in which people are being successful while they're out? If you only look for negative outcomes, that's all you're going to find. And we just don't make the effort to measure more positive outcomes.
So one question I'd like to pose to both of you. The one area in which we, at least on paper, would seem to differ from pretty much every other system I can think of in the world, is how we treat race and poverty. In our system, race and poverty is a tool really that's used by for incarceration. It has been since for the last several centuries, and if you compare it with other places, I would imagine you'd see less of that. And I mean, that's my assumption. I'm wondering if both of you share that, and what difference that makes in designing a much better, more humane system in the United States.
Well, I think the legacy of historical marginalization in the form of slavery, colonization, I think it exists in many countries, especially if we're looking at Europe. It might exist on a different scale here. But I've certainly observed it in France as well, that individuals of North African descent were certainly going through very specific struggles as they returned to the community, because they were dealing with a double stigma of their status as a former prisoner and also because of their minority status. And I think the
legacy of colonialism as well, I assume.
Yes, exactly. Slavery, colonialism. And what's interesting now, I think, in the era in which we find ourselves now, is that these conversations really used to be limited to critical left-leaning academics, and that's no longer the case. I think this is a reality that we can no longer ignore. We can't talk about mass incarceration without talking about our history.
And I emphasize that as well. And I have to say, it's actually one of my it's very difficult to do international work in the US on anything because America is so America-centric. But I think particularly one of the things that I'm used to hearing is, like we have such a big problem in our country, and we're so unique and we do it so differently. Right. Actually, that's not the case. Race is an issue everywhere. In Europe, it is overwhelmingly an issue. I just came back from several countries in Europe where we did some events. I was in Portugal, I was in Austria, I was in Italy. Race is an issue in all of these places. I'm actually working on a film project currently that's about that's sort of a version of 13th, but in a European context. Because the sad reality is that they're not legally allowed to collect data on race in the prisons or anything else in a European context. It's illegal. And so it's obvious when you walk into a prison, as I did a couple of weeks ago in Portugal, or any other country, for the most part in Europe, especially the 4 countries that had the largest role to play in the slave trade, that there is overwhelming, over-incarceration of people of color, of former, of immigrants from those who were part of the former colonial empires. And in fact, when we look at the Maori in New Zealand, when we look at, all Indigenous folks in Canada, Black Canadians, this is an issue that is a reality everywhere.
How do you fix that? I mean, is it? I mean, you can't discard the fact that it's going on. It's interesting that you pointed out.
Well, for one, you guys talked about it, and I think the problem is that it's not talked about. And we have some wonderful partners in Europe, all across the European continent, and almost none of them take on race in their work. And that's one thing that we're working with them to address, other than the UK. where there is data, where there is attention to this. And it is not talked about, it is not addressed. And I mean, even in the, Scandinavia, which is everyone's imagined utopia, more than 30%, it's probably higher by now, but more than 30% of their prison population is foreign born, mostly from Eastern Europe. So, it's like the elephant in the room that folks are not addressing. So for all the journalists present who want to report on something international, that's a place to start, like that big elephant in the room. And the way, yes, we are the McDonald's of mass incarceration, but also, just like McDonald's, the same system, versions of it exist all over.
So there's no utopia out there that we might take a lesson from.
No, and I noticed that somebody asked about A$AP Rocky's case in the Q&A. This is the rapper who was in Sweden. I didn't follow it that closely. I did follow it, and I have to see that. I'm glad to be reminded that I want to watch the documentary. But yeah, there's a perfect example. He's a Black man in Sweden. Yes, he's an American rapper. Yes, he's, a celebrity and all of that, but he's still a Black man in Sweden. And, so for all these utopias, there's still that racial elephant in the room.
What about class? How does that figure into what the systems that you've been studying abroad? I mean, it's obvious poor people are less likely to get out of going to prison, even if they've committed an offense. But is it a more serious situation, a serious challenge in other countries than it is for us? Lila, if you want to start with that, I mean, what have you found in France?
I think like everywhere, race and ethnicity are closely intertwined. I use ethnicity because Europeans don't like the term race. They say it's a typically American term that they don't like. And being Canadian myself, we were taught in school that there's only one race, the human race. So, but yeah, so everywhere in every cultural setting, I think socioeconomic status and ethnicity or minority status are closely intertwined. I think the difference in European countries is that they tend to have stronger social welfare systems. So it can counter a little bit of some of the effects of poverty, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's very similar to here. The prisons are not filled with white collar criminals. They are filled with people who belong to lower socioeconomic classes.
Yes.
No, I think that's right, and I think they always play out together. Right. So whether we're talking about, race or we're talking about skin tone, the colorism as exists in parts of the world where we work, India, for example, all of these things get played out. I mean, colorism works even heavily in the context of the US justice system. Like there was a study done on parole and, skin tones and parole boards. Mm-hmm. So inevitably, they're intertwined all over the world. I've never seen a context in which they didn't go hand in hand.
What about the role of government? Obviously, we're talking about many different types of approaches to the criminal justice system around the world. Does Europe, for instance, particularly Northern Europe, Scandinavia, one assumes that, there's a social welfare system to create a cushion when people get out of prison. But how much does it matter that you have a government or people in the government or a bureaucracy that's a little bit more enlightened and less inclined to be retributive than rehabilitative? That's the word.
Well, I mean, from where I sit, I struggle quite a bit with. I mean, we talk a lot about the importance of raising awareness and, get people to see things differently or get the general public to see things differently. I certainly think, of course, I mean, I'm in the business of doing that, so I believe it matters but I also believe that targeting the right people in a lot of countries, it's about like getting through to the right person and taking a sort of, and having them take a top-down approach. Because there are examples of governments that have said, I don't care if this isn't popular, it makes sense and we're going to do it. And then we're going to find a way to convince the public to buy into this. And I think one of the most inspiring examples in that regard is Uruguay. When Uruguay became the first country in the world to legalize marijuana, cannabis. And they did it against public opinion. People did not want to legalize, but they said this makes sense. And it was mainly out of, we don't want to be caught in the drug wars of our neighbors as this small, relatively stable country, you know, between much larger countries. And then they hired a marketing firm to sell this to the public, and they included academics in that, and they, you know, who had the data and so on and so forth. I think about Finland as an example in that regard too. Finland, to me, which is why I always cite Finland a lot more than Norway, because it's more relevant, I think, to a US context. Finland was operating on the Russian style system of incarceration. They had a very high incarceration rate. And in the early 2000s decided, you know what, we're gonna go with the Swedish approach, because they've consistently, historically vacillated between a Russian approach to things and a Swedish approach. And I'm summarizing, it's much more, you know, intricate than that. But they ultimately decided, we're going to switch this up, and we're going to create open prison systems. We're going to radically decarcerate, and build an other system. And that's what they did. Their Finland mediation system is also incredibly strong. It's a government program. They're one of our partners, and they'll mediate. You know, mediation is their first go-to with, you know, situations that involve crime, including violent crime. So, and I don't think that, you know, so the public didn't matter there. So I don't, you know, I'm all about, you know, either or and both. And so we have to sort of go for all of it in terms of shifting public opinion that then trickles up to politicians, and also attracts different folks to that space. But I also think there's a way that, you know, we can get in with smart governments that say, doesn't matter if the public doesn't get this. The public, you know, the public are suckers anyway. So let's figure out how to sell this to them in a way that's smart.
Lila, I'd be interested in your take about the role of government in terms of rehabilitation and prison reform.
I mean, I think one distinctive feature of the U.S. system that might make it a bit more difficult to establish reform is that we don't have a centralized system here, whereas other countries do. We're basically 50 separate little countries here, and the federal government can't tell states what to do. That's federalism. And so it's much easier in other countries, smaller countries, right, that have centralized system to impose reform. That being said, most of our prison populations tend to be state prison populations, not federal prison populations. So really states, if they want to, they need to be at the helm of prison reform.
So what we like to think of states as laboratories of reform in many ways. So, you know, this is really to both of you. If we were trying to design a new system from scratch, what are the elements that we might take from the places that you studied? I'm particularly fascinated, Baz, by the idea of the open prison system. I mean, I don't know if that's translatable at all. I don't really understand totally what it means, but I'd be interested in seeing what aspects of the different systems you've looked at, you know, we might use in some way to change how we do things here. I know there are some model, some experimental systems or approaches underway in Pennsylvania, for instance, but I wonder whether you can just sort of design for us what a system would look like that really is less retributive and has a, you know, a sense of hope and
the magic bullet. That's the
magic bullet. Yeah.
What's the answer, right?
Well, I'm not looking for the magic bullet. I'm looking for
there's many
bullet.
Bullet in plural, you know, but I think, I mean, for one, obviously, you know, a system of social services and social support that prevents crime in the first place. Like, I think first and foremost, that means education, healthcare, you know, all of the things that we don't do well, and thinking about how to do them well and take care of people across the board, and uplift communities. That's first and foremost. When it comes to, you know, scenarios where people have committed harm, I think one, yes, I do find the open prison model. And open prisons, we basically just means that there is a porous wall that people who are in open prisons can work on the outside, can go to school on the outside. can live life on the outside and be as integrated in communities as is possible, given that you don't have total liberty. And we already have that technically in the US. It's called work release. We have educational release on the books too. One thing I don't see enough of in the US movement is a push for those things to be used and used well. When we have work release facilities, one of them just closed here in New York, Lincoln. Lincoln closed, and it was a mess. It was designed to fail. The actual facility was so bad on the inside that when folks came back and this I was told by people who lived there and experienced this, that the conditions were so bad on the inside there that it made coming back that much worse when you left. So you need to be able to support people, help people find quality jobs and make connections on the outside. You have to actually build these up. When we have them, which is not often at all, we don't do them well. And any of the experiments that I've seen in this country with that kind of a system have been, frankly, BS. Like, they've not been open. What they do is put lipstick on a pig, and that's including the Pennsylvania experiment, that it was about like painting the cell to be a nicer color, quite literally. The idea is open. People need to come and go. I think, and I say this as having founded a college program inside a prison that Lila, the wonderful Lila, taught in as well. We need to not have to build these on the inside. Students should be able to come out and study on the outside, even if they're incarcerated. Queensboro Correctional Facility, which is a state facility right here in Long Island City, Queens, sits across the street from LaGuardia Community College. Tell me why the students can't go outside and go to school on the outside. So I think that porous model is really important to develop. And I definitely think community justice centers and also restorative justice implemented in a really big way, but a personalized way, not like a one size fits all model, but thinking about the youth justice system of New Zealand, how it's been able to implement Maori restorative practices almost across the board for juveniles, and family group conferencing, which is another, they're both partners in our network that do incredible work. Right here in New York, we do have common justice. In the States, we have impact justice that works nationally. So we've got, the Costa Rica National Restorative Justice Program, the Washington, D.C. Restorative Justice Program that I was just visiting in the Office of the Attorney General. I think we can really invest in robust kinds of restorative justice programs that are systematized, built out, and supported and funded really, really well in order to do the work well. I mean, Red Hook Community Justice Center, who's one of our partners, I always think about the fact that I visited them I visit them often now, but the first time I visited them, I just come back from a whole bunch of countries visiting all of our partners. And right here in my own backyard is something that I think is one of the most profound models of how to do justice. Right, sitting in Brooklyn, the Red Hook Community Justice Center. It's not only about criminal justice, it's about community justice and community building. How do we scale that out on a level where it's like in all the communities all over the world?
Just to follow up immediately on that, Baz, who do you find are the most active or interested advocates for change in the countries that you go to? Are they prison officials? Are they correctional officers? Are they outside advocates? I mean, who are the people who are motivating and promoting change? Are they the same around the world, or are they different?
Yeah, almost always NGOs and folks outside the system. Absolutely. Almost never folks inside the system who are not paid well. They're not incentivized to innovate and think outside the box. And sometimes that's not their fault. I'm not saying it's the system's fault. I've not been anywhere where corrections wasn't either the lowest item on the budget or the second lowest item on the budget. Mm-hmm. So we're not, I always say we need that Silicon Valley money in order to really affect change. You need to be able to experiment with lots of innovation. And, they're building 1,000 apps at a time in Silicon Valley. Where is that in the space of justice innovation? And it does cost money. I think a lot of this does cost money. Reentry costs money. You need like an army of support for every one person who comes home. Having worked in the reentry space, in a direct service kind of way for a decade, I can say that. And it never, as Lila was talking about, like, it's never just an upward journey. It's full of ups and downs, and you need support. That costs money. It's people, and people cost.
So Lila, where would you experiment? I mean, what would you do if you were trying to put together a system from scratch that looked a lot different from what we have now?
Yeah, I agree with Baz's points. I would say a long-term goal, first of all, with such a system would be not to make prisons so incompatible with the outside world. Every way that we've set up the prison, the institution of prison, is incompatible with the outside world.
You mean without walls, or what? Or
not necessarily without walls, just the way that the attitudes and behaviors that people have to adopt to survive on the inside are incompatible with what we advocate on the outside. And the second people get out, we expect them to just snap their fingers and turn that switch off, and that's just not realistic. So we need to create, that's the long-term goal, a system, if we're gonna have a confinement system that's a continuation of life on the outside, not so starkly incompatible with the principles and morals that we advocate on the outside. That's the first part of it. And the sort of short-term goals and solutions, because of course, as I said, systemic change takes time. We don't need to strip people of all their rights while they're on the inside. This is something that could be, easily fixed. It's so unnecessary for people not to have the right to vote and to lose all these civic rights that they have on the outside. So I think that's one of the things that, for instance, the Norwegian system is very good at, is making sure that you don't send people who are incarcerated to the margins of society, that you keep these mechanisms in place so that they might still remain active citizens, even if they're not on the outside. So I think these are just crucial points for that. And one thing I want to add here is, we tend to be so pessimistic when we compare ourselves to other nations. We tend to say, well, other places do it so much better than we do. But initially, these other countries were inspired by us, by our Constitution. That was the initial point of this. I think we forget about this. The idea of banning cruel and unusual punishment, which inspired many European prison systems, that's from our Constitution. It's our state of Michigan that was the first English-speaking jurisdiction in the world to abolish capital punishment. So these are our fundamental principles that we just seem to have steered away from in recent decades. And
we did begin 200 years ago with the approach with the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia, as the idea that prison could be a redemptive place rather than just a punishment place. That never worked out, but I mean, it's still there, I suppose, and ideally.
Right, and that's the shift from the so-called penitentiary system to the correctional system. Now we have to correct people because there's something wrong with them.
Well, let me, we have about 10 minutes, and we have some questions, a few that you've answered already that are in the Q&A box. But let me ask you sort of a wild theoretical question, which is what we were asking really at the beginning of this whole conference: is, what are prisons for? I mean, what do we need them for? We know there's a prison abolition movement, and nobody takes that much seriously. But what is the point of prison? Obviously, we have criminality, criminal behavior, some very bad, some not so bad, that threatens public safety, and prisons or confinement institutions play into that. But what do we want? What should we want a 21st century prison to do? Whoever wants to try that one on for size first, be my guest.
Well, I'll start by saying I am an abolitionist, and I do take abolitionism very, very seriously.
Okay.
And I am 100% working toward a world in which there are no prisons. I don't expect to see it in my lifetime, but I definitely believe we will look back eventually and look at this system of, prisons and say, oh my God, we did that the same way we look at the guillotine and other kinds of, chopping hands off and so on, although that still happens in parts of the world. But the same way we look at penal colonies and, other stuff, I think we're 100% going to look at this medieval, archaic thing that we do and say, oh my God, how did we ever call that a justice system? And every single time that I'm in a city, which is often, where I travel, through the city and see this medieval dungeon looking thing from the 19th century, I think to myself, that is the emblem of like the most outdated approach that exists. We don't send people to hospitals that look like they did in 1848. But we send people to prisons that do, and justice systems that do. So I think, that has to be radically undone. I think the law as a system as well, and this is definitely true in a lot of the countries where we work as an organization, the law is a colonial entity. It has been cut the same way that prisons have been cut and pasted all over the world in places where they don't apply. The British and European legal system has been cut and pasted in parts all over the global South in ways that don't fit. And so when we talk about abolition, it's not only about reforming prisons and abolishing prisons, creating a system, as I just described, that's grounded in community justice centers and restorative justice and facilities that might involve, there might be a place for a facility, but it looks so unlike what we call prison as to be worthy of another name altogether. That we also have to think about how these legal structures and systems, our system is also a colonial imposition. We need to think about building, systems of do's and don'ts and how we deal with do's and don'ts and, rethinking the whole process of what the courtroom is and how the courtroom doesn't work to bring, victims, survivors of harm, the healing that they deserve, how it's superimposed on a society. All of these things need to be like radically rethought.
Baz,
are you there at the same place? I'm Lila, I'm sorry, are you there at the same place?
No, I differ from Baz a little bit in that I'm not an abolitionist. I've mainly because I've sat across people who have point blank told me that once they are released, they are going to get out and go cause great harm to people. They are extreme cases. There are very, very few cases, but they do exist. And in those circumstances, I don't think it's appropriate for people to just be out there. That being said, they don't need to be punished beyond the deprivation of their liberties. So we need to rethink what prison is in itself, and maybe it even needs to change its name. It's got to be, Andrew Scott Nickey, our colleague at Manhattan College, refers to it as facilities for care. Let's change the name, let's change the philosophy of it, let's change how we operate those things. But I think that there are individuals, again, very minute proportion, but they do still exist, who are openly talking about causing harm. And I think that in all of my interviews that I've conducted with prisoners over the years, I don't have a single account of a prisoner who said, it's the punitive dimensions of prisons that have helped me turn my life around. It's never the punitive dimensions of prison. Punishment simply doesn't work. So what does?
What does? Is it rehabilitation we're talking about, or redemption, or
restorative justice? If we're talking about prisoners, I think the first thing to address is histories of trauma and victimization, which just tends to be so extensive. So that's the starting point of it. But so prison in itself, maybe that institution, as it's called, as it's currently structured, needs to go. But there's there has to be some form of something for individuals who pose a serious threat to public safety.
And I would say we don't design a system. I don't disagree, but I think in the sense that we don't design a system for the exceptions. We design a system for the rule. And so, in my book, I call them interventions. Like, I think there's a space for interventions. But I think even when we look at the history of prison, the early, the early forms of confinement were about holding people in a space while we figured out what justice looked like. It was only, in the early 19th century that we thought of prisons as the version of justice itself, right? And came up with this started pushing this enlightenment idea that 5 years equals this, creating these artificial mathematical equations that I think are, utterly ridiculous.
But confinement, as Lila was suggesting, it still has to be part of the mix for people who are particularly dangerous or pose a particularly dangerous society. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, but I think that that's not, again, I think that that's an overwhelmingly small number of people. And I'm more interested in focusing on building, the systems for the rule and not the exception. And I would also argue that many of those people that say that and that, we might categorize as such, we also need to rewind again, getting back to the social services issue, getting back to the communities of care issue, and say what wasn't in place for them, which is probably a whole lot.
There's a question that hasn't been asked yet or answered from Mr. Johnson, which is right to that point, which says, she says she often hears people willing to look at reform for drug and or property crimes, yet they see punitive incarceration as appropriate for rapists, pedophiles, and murderers. So what does reform mean for those types of offenses?
Yeah, I think when we talk about, we tend to go for the low-hanging fruit when we talk about prison reform. We're always going for people who are involved in drug offenses or low-level property offenses, but the conversation stops when it comes to violent offenders, right? And that's a great question that's been raised. And if we're really serious about criminal justice reform in this country, we also need to revisit how we sentence and punish individuals who commit really serious forms of crime as well. And part of that is investment in prevention. That's the most important part, right? So we like to say that we are tough on crime in this country, but actually we're tough on the so-called criminals. And we punish more and more and more. And that punishment is something that just perpetuates that cycle of violence and the policies that perpetuate that. So there's a lot that we can do in terms of how we respond to violence that just has not been effective in preventing further violence.
And I would just add that I know that you're going to hear from the wonderful Danielle Sered, in the next panel, and I know she'll have plenty to say on this. But and Common Justice is one of our partners in the network, and I would say that all of our restorative justice partners and practitioners that I've collaborated with and learned from all over the world would all say that actually it's the quote unquote violent crimes that are most responsive to a restorative justice approach. I'll let, I know you're going to get into this in the further session, but I also think that, dividing between violent, non-violent, drug offender, not drug offender, we need to recognize how artificial these categories are. And that's why it's actually most helpful to think in terms of harm and not crime, especially in relation to the point that I was making earlier about, how much of what gets, legal, how legal systems are often, quite disconnected from morality, and that we should always be focusing on harm over and above crime.
Maurice, it looks like you're on there for a question.
Well, I was going to just point out that what's been said by Frank Baumgartner and others is that when we talk about violent crimes, it's a very small percentage of all crime. And, that we shouldn't lose track of the fact that that is a small number of the people that get incarcerated. A small number of people who become convicted felons. And, admittedly, these are the small number of the people that are now, 200,000 people doing life, which is a huge problem. But I think we need to keep that in perspective.
And I would also say, I would take issue with, I don't use the term murderer. I mean, a person who has committed murder is not necessarily a murderer. A murderer implies that you're out there every day, that is your task, that in life, that is your mission. So I think we have to be careful, not only with the language in terms of sensitivity, but in terms of the reality of what it is to say, this person is a murderer.
Can I just add one last thing on that note? Sorry.
Absolutely, yes.
I think this is also important in reporting. Language is really important. So here we refer to sex offenders. In the French context, they refer to authors of a sexual offense. So in one case, it's who you are, and the other, it's what you did. And these are very important distinctions, I think. And the language that we use and put out there is really crucial.
That must sound better in French than it does in English.
Yeah, it's a little awkward.
And which brings me to the last.
You're muted.
The last thing I want to ask as we close, since we are talking to a media audience, is really, what role do you think the media plays in all this? I mean, you've seen the systems across the world, and you've also seen the different approaches that media, the journalists have taken. Do you see any places and areas where journalists have a particularly important role, or are they just really recording what they see, which is enough, I suppose?
I think it would be great if we can see more of the nuances that surround certain crimes. So not only if we can report a bit more about, yes, the individual factors that might lead people to relapse into crime, but also some of the structural factors that might lead to criminal behavior. And I almost never in the news read about positive cases, cases of people who are succeeding, who are doing well, who've been released from prison, and who are actually being an asset to their communities. It would, in a day and age where the news is always just so heavy to read, it would be so wonderful and it really important for educating the public to see more of these positive stories.
Is there more access elsewhere to the prison environment, these institutions, than there is in the U.S.? Because that's a big problem, obviously, here. Beth?
Access to media?
No, to the institutions themselves, to get into prisons, to make them accountable, make them transparent. Certainly don't have that here.
Yeah, it varies a lot from country to country. I mean, there are some places where it's a bit easier, but I'd say it's not dramatically, more accessible in any of the countries that I've been in. But I would say, I mean, I'm sure you've had plenty of talk about the importance of language and the importance of focusing on the structural. But I would say just really look hard at your story and determine whether it's propping up the system. Because even if it's a positive story, which I see plenty of, the guy who comes out and does good, or the woman who, comes home and has done X, Y, and Z, it still ends up in some ways, even without meaning to, it ends up supporting the system that it's allegedly critiquing. And so until we focus on the fact that maybe this person didn't need to be locked up in the first place, so it's not enough that this person got 5 college degrees, came home and changed the world. How about rewind the clock and say, what were we doing when we locked this person up in the first place? And recognizing how important that is. And I guess I would say my other plea would be to recognize that this isn't only, report on this globally. I think this is true about so many things, but you can be global and local at the same time. You can think about the importance of this, and especially the importance, we didn't get into this all that much, but the US is still actively exporting its system. We are paying for, military trainings for corrections officers for other countries, particularly in Central and South America, and in countries that are deemed, an issue to us because of migration or terrorism. And so I don't see almost any reporting on the ways that we are promoting the system all over the world.
That would be a great story. I hope somebody's picking that up and working on it. So you've given us a lot to chew on, which is exactly where I wanted to end this part of our conference. And I hope you guys can stay around a little bit if you're able to for our roundtable, where we'll have some pushback and talk back from some of the journalists themselves, as well as having Danielle with us. So we'll take a 10-minute break now. If you guys can stay, if you have the time, that would be great. If not, everybody else, please come back at 4:55 or so, and we'll go into our final stretch and our final session. Thanks very much. Thanks to both of you. And we'll be speaking and getting more of your views, I think, online as well.
Thanks.
We'll take a 10-minute break. Thank
you.
Thank you.